Hey, you are listening to Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast,
I'm your co-host, Mark,
and I'm your other co-host, Josh.
and we have with us V. Castro today, author of many books and travels to cons and does all kinds of stuff.
Yes, hello everyone. It's so good to talk to you today, talk with you. Yeah, and guys, thanks for having me.
Of course, I was really blown away by the fact that we were able to get you on this podcast because I found your book Goddess of Filth last year on a complete blind buy at Barnes and Nobles.
Yeah,
I was like
the spine.
the spine is an actual human spine, and
Yep,
your most recent book out of
Atslon. Yeah,
Aslan also has that, and I was like,
yep.
okay. Uh, so before we jump into the books, I gotta ask. It's a weird question, but what's up with the spines on the spine?
So Creature, I had nothing to do with that. Creature Publishing they are the ones that created the kind of the design for both the covers. A really amazing artist named Luisa. She's on Instagram, and um, yeah, she did all of the design, and they just kind of wanted to, because they mostly do novella length works. They pretty much all do novella length works, and they just wanted a cool spine for to keep it like, their library, I guess, consistent, but it's really cool. So yeah, they came up with that. I can't take credit for that.
And apparently they just took it as the most literal sense they could.
Yeah, they just did exactly the spine.
Look, I'm not mad about it. I really like because I think if it wasn't for this, I wouldn't have even picked this book
Seen
up.
it.
But I was just absolutely in love with the artwork for this. This is
Yeah, she's great.
Goddess of Filth. If you guys are watching this on our Patreon, this is a book I highly recommend. It was probably I think it was like ended up being like my second favorite book I read last
Oh,
year.
thank you. Well,
And
fingers
so,
crossed, watch this space. I wrote the screenplay for it, so
oh, all right.
What
Uh,
movie? What was
yeah,
that?
go.
oh, I wrote
What?
the screenplay, Goddess of Filth screenplay, so fingers crossed.
Oh, okay.
I need that to be at a future film festival. We run a horror mental health film festival, and I need that out there. Um, so we'll be in touch after this is over.
Yeah.
Uh, um, but before we jump into kind of the bulk of some of these stories, you actually got your start from the research that I gathered doing these kind of like short stories as a part of an anthology that would kind of be like the book equivalent of something like VHS.
Yeah.
Um, could you kind of talk about being a part of these like larger stories and what it was specifically about that form of writing that kind of made you attached you originally to want to pursue shorter stories in the beginning?
Yeah, I think just, when you're starting out, like if you want to get published and you write a novel. So the first thing I wrote was a novel, but the road to publication is not a straightforward one. It's not always easy. So basically, while you wait, and publishing is very, very slow, I would do other things. I would write short stories, submit them, lots of rejections. You look up different calls for different projects. And so it was just kind of me saying, oh, I really like that concept, which was rewind or die. Because I grew up, I'm 43, I grew up with Blockbuster.
Yeah, same.
I grew up with video stores. I grew up with like, walking in and in one of my collections, Mestiza Blood, in Truck Stop, the protagonist I have, it's set in a video store because it just made video stores were just such a huge part of like my upbringing, massive. Um, so I just loved that concept of the rewind or die, and I wanted something that would, one of those covers when I walked into Blockbuster or the corner part of the grocery store with the videos. I'd be like, ooh, that looks really cool. That looks like something my parents really wouldn't want me to watch, but I'll watch it anyway. Or I'll watch it a sleepover. Um, so, yeah, that was kind of it. And a novella is a bit easier to write than another novel while you're waiting to get published for said novel. Um, yeah, it just, I kind of just went when things came to me and they presented themselves, I went for it.
And
The,
I,
the
go ahead, Mark.
the process of writing is kind of interesting, and I've always wondered, how do you, because I know with music and bands, to get signed, you either have to be accidentally discovered by an agent that's looking or recommended by somebody. So if somebody's trying to write a book or a novel or a short story that's never been published, how do they go about that process to kind of get in the door?
You just have to, most agents only want novels because obviously they can get money for that. And most big publishers, like big five, big publishers, want novels. So you just submit it to the agents. You just submit, submit, submit. You won't hear from many. Sometimes you'll get a manuscript request, but you've got to hit these agents with like the first 5 pages with your query letter, just like boom. Um, it took my fourth novel to get an agent. 4 novels.
Jeez.
Yeah.
So it's
So
All
not,
it's
right.
the kind of thing. But what's crazy is that, a lot of horror readers love novellas. Novellas are, I don't understand why, and I've talked to editors why they don't understand why big publishing doesn't, I understand it's a business, but people like novellas, especially indie horror. Um, I think horror really lends itself to the novella.
Yeah, I was about to say, I was like, I feel like some of the best books that like I've read recently have all been like horror novellas. Like we just had Nathan D. Ludwig on. He's the writer of the horror novella Love Potion number 666. It's a wild, crazy. This is a wild and crazy ride. And Goddess of Filth, like I finished reading it. I was like immediately I was like, all right, how long should I give it before like rereading it again? Because you know, I am praising, but like also at the same time, like it's this really unique story because it's this coming of age story. It's this sexual awakening story for the main protagonist, but also at the same like time, it's also telling this very compelling, very different uh exorcist story exorcism story, sorry. And that's really what drew me to it was the fact that it was taking these familiar elements of the genre, but saying we're gonna make it this just a little bit differently. And so like I guess I'm always curious about like writers that are taking new spins on these familiar elements. What is it specifically about the religious horror or like the exorcism subgenre of horror in general that made you kind of want to approach it for a Goddess of Filth and at the same time kind of give this coming of age story? Because as the as the story develops, you're also kind of really getting to see some of the best character development I've seen in a book in a long time.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I love your shirt, by the way.
Thank you.
I mean, The Exorcist, I watched again. It was one of those things I watched way too young. I think a lot of us did. Um, and I mean, I loved possession films, always, being raised Catholic, but also being around botanicas and being around superstition. Like the spirit world is very real. Demons are real, ghosts are real. Now, I'm not practicing Catholic, but I have like lots of Santa Muerte in my office. So I light candles. I have Santa Muerte everywhere. And so it's, that kind of thing. It's never far from reality. But I guess as you get older, you watch more movies, and it was always the same kind of possession. And I wanted to see more than just like, the devil, because what is the devil? What is evil? What is, these young girls? I mean, look at the Salem witch trials. They were deemed evil and dirty and, um, you know, being a young female, especially at a certain age, you're demonized, but you're also highly desired. Virgins, highly desired for various reasons, but yet damned if they express their sexuality beyond what's expected of them or express it beyond the pleasure of someone else. And so I just thought, I want to write about this, but I also want to bring in like other gods, other creatures, kind of like in uh um I don't even know my own books. The Queen of the Cicadas. I brought in the Queen of the Dead, who
Yeah.
also is like La Muerte. Um, these all these beliefs to bring in new ideas because yeah, there's that saying there's nothing new under the sun. And granted, yes, a lot of our ideas and different cultures have different tales for the same kind of happenings, but why not have fun with it? And yeah, like I said, coming of age is, everybody's gone through it. We've all grown up. We've all experienced fear. We all question our sexuality at some point. We all um, kind of reject authority or accept it. So there's a lot of universal themes that as humans we all kind of experience, but I wanted to just bring in what my culture and my personal beliefs. Um, yeah, it was a short story that was rejected, and I was really gutted.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a short story that was rejected, and I gave it to, and then the publisher wanted the Queen of Cicadas, and I was like, well, I'm trying to get an agent, but I have this idea, and so they were like, yeah, let's make that into a novella. And it just kind of happened. It sparked. So it was meant to be something more, and just the way the universe kind of worked things out, it became this book, and I'm really happy it did.
Well, you teased a film on that, so fingers crossed. Uh, but you mentioned the Queen of Cicadas, and I gotta imagine that as a writer, this is a story that is so much larger in scope because it is something that is taking place over a multitude of not only decades but generations.
Yeah.
And how hard is it to kind of keep that in line? Like, what was the writing process? Did you like write like one generation first and then kind of like intersperse the other ones? Um, like what's kind of the creative process for handling a story of such vast scopes?
Well, it's interesting because The Haunting of Alejandra does the same thing. It's about mental health. It's about postnatal depression, um, and the mental health of women through this entire bloodline, all the way back to the conquest. Just like in the Queen of Cicadas, I go back to the conquest in like Mesoamerica. Um, the way I write, because I am a total pantser, I, except for Aliens Vasquez, I typically don't outline, and I probably should, but my brain finds it really tough to outline. It'll just go from like different pieces to different pieces, but I think I would read over it and then I would think of these characters. Oh, this person should do this and should be at this timeline. And I would just write what I wanted to write and slot it in. And then to where it made sense. And it would give like, a natural break from tension or explain things. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to show like the whole scope of because oftentimes, we are part of a bigger story, a bigger picture. Um, we have family members who've done this, that, or the other, or family legends, and I just wanted to capture that. I wanted to capture, you know, the horror of secrets and of our pasts that maybe passed down. So you got that in Queen of Cicadas, but you get it even more in The Haunting of Alejandra, of the unknown coming back to literally haunt you, or more, more than just haunt.
So the that makes me even more excited for the Haunting of Alejandra. It's going to be dropping in the spring, April 18th, 2023. My last question before we jump into the film portion of the podcast is you mentioned Aliens, Vasquez, and Aliens is such a notable franchise. Is it intimidating, like adding a voice to such a recognizable franchise?
Yes and no, because you want to do the character justice, and you want the hardcore fans to like it. Um, and again, I did my best to kind of bring her to life because she's so iconic. That she's one of these people, like you say Vasquez, you automatically think of the red bandana and the body and the pull-ups, and I mean it just, and again, growing up, I just, one of those icons, those, Latina icons, and I was like, yeah, I want to do this. And again, the way the universe kind of, conspired to make it happen, after I'd published a bit. Uh, but also the licensor also does a lot to ensure that you kind of stay in line. They put a leash on you. They put a creative leash on you, like, okay, here you go. You need to do this, and this is, you can't say that. And um, so I felt decently safe, but you just never know. With any book, you just never know it. Once it's out there, it's out there.
Well, before we jump into the book, if you guys are interested, the movie, uh, Aliens Vasquez, out of Sidlan. Am I saying that right?
Out of Aztlan, yeah.
Uh,
Aztlan, yeah.
yeah. Mestizla blood.
Mestiza. Yeah,
Mestiza. Yeah,
Mestiza blood. That's all right.
I'm terrible with these. The
Don't
Queen of
worry.
Cicadas, Goddess of Filth, and of course the previously mentioned Hairspray and Switchblades are all available now. The Haunting of Alejandra comes out April 18th, 2023.
Yes.
And so we'll provide links in the show notes below where you guys can pick these up. But
Yeah.
Mark, what are we talking about on this episode?
Crap, I forgot the name of the movie.
Oh, look. This is like one of my favorite things because I love tigers, but
Yeah,
she's
it's
on my
Tiger. Oh
That's
crap.
amazing.
What was the name of the movie? I forgot. It was Tiger
Uh,
something.
on
all
not.
right. Yeah, tigers are not afraid. And
Yeah.
the reason why I really felt like we wanted to do something like this is because this particular story is because of one of the things that you'll find in V's books is that all of them are written from a Mexican standpoint. Heritage is very prominent in one of your books. I would definitely say it's like the foundation for every book I've read of yours so far. And then female characters that are a representation of that. And this film is directed by Isla Lopez, who this was the first time I watched this movie, and I was bawling by the end of this
I
movie.
was I was like, I thought this was horror. God damn it. It's like I was bawling my eyes out, like it just ripped my hair, my hair out. I was like, my heart out. It really, I was like, what is wrong with me? I am crying like crazy.
I
Um,
I've actually heard about this movie and it's been on my list for a while.
Same.
It's one of those things where when I get time to sit down and watch a movie, a lot of times I'm just too tired for subtitles. It's one of
yeah,
those things
a
where I
lot of
just want to
people.
watch a movie.
Hmm.
But I tried, and this is, we talk a lot about mental health and different things people go through. The last about a month or so, I've been having issues with just having a hard time really sitting down and watching anything, being interested in anything. And this movie for me kind of fell victim to that a couple times. I think this morning was the third time I watched it in the last like week and a half. And it comes down to being so much on my mind and going on that I had a hard time
It's
really
hard.
focusing on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough, I think it's a really, it's not like one of your old comfort films. You know, some films you can go back and you can mindlessly watch and it's almost like a comfort watch. So
It,
like one of my comfort watches is like Bram Stoker's Dracula with you know,
Nice.
things like that.
we did
When
an
you see
episode
it and
not
it's
long ago
on The
on that.
Lost Boys, like you know, this, and actually Tiger's Not Afraid makes me think of like The Lost Boys and Peter Pan's Lost Boys, and you know, the Lost Boys, the vampire Lost Boys, even though they're not vampires, just kind of this group of kids that, you
Yeah.
know, are kind of just
It's
lost.
in some ways this really reminded me a lot of Grave of the Fireflies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
No.
No.
It's Miyazaki, Studio Ghibli. One of the most depressing movies you'll ever watch in your life.
I think
Uh,
a lot of those are.
oh no, it's a good movie, but it's one people watch once. It's World War II, and they've actually found where if you take like the poster for the movie and brighten it up, you can see bombers flying over top. And the way the picture's done, it looks like it's
And
two
is wait,
kids.
I have seen it. Isn't it the kid dies
The
or
two
something?
kids living in the cave trying to
Yes, I
survive where
have
their
seen
village
that,
has
and I
been
was
bombed.
like, I thought this was a cartoon.
Yeah. And
I
it,
remember
it
seeing that in college. Yeah,
yeah, in quite a few ways, this kind of reminded me of that. You had in Grave of the Fireflies, you had the family was essentially killed, and the kids went off to survive in a cave. In this case, cartels were a cartel took out the different kids' families, and they're kind of forming their own gang just to survive, kind of
yeah,
thing. And it falls in that category of a movie you kind of watch once, maybe twice to make sure you got everything.
yep.
Uh,
It's a hard
yeah,
watch.
yeah. My daughter was watching it this morning with me, and she's like, "This is like super depressing, Dad."
It is because it does. Well, it does border on that, but I think you know that's where like horror, you can do with horror what you can't do with other genres is you can explore that stuff that's really hard to talk about. Um, the subjects that, you know, that are there or the inclinations that are there, the shadow parts of us. But horror, you can really dive deep. Um, so Eric LaRocca, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He writes a lot of horror novellas and short stories. And I just read one of his short stories about uh, this guy. Oh no, it's a woman who is supposed to watch her sister's baby, but she just wants to burn the baby. And you're like, and I'm reading this story like, I couldn't look away, but just the emotion, the raw emotion of it was just like intense. Um, and there was another story in there about this relationship where this person's you know, in a wheelchair and parts of them are missing because they're feeding themselves to their lover who really couldn't care less about him as long as they were still getting pieces of them. I'm not going to ruin the story, but it's just like so harrowing and almost like, well, a lot of people have been in those relationships. You aren't physically feeding someone like your eyeball or your cheek or your thigh, meat from your thigh, but we have been in those relationships where we're literally slicing pieces and offering them to someone who really doesn't care, and it's
Yeah.
painful.
It's horror as a whole is just an interesting topic because of the
Yeah.
way they handle things. Even if you like, we're talking about books and movies, but even if you get into like the video game side of things, Silent Hill specifically
Oh my goodness.
deals with a lot of stuff. You have like in the second one deals that there's these creatures you run into in one of the side characters, and you find out the creatures are a manifestation of her fear of being molested by her dad.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The series
Okay, did not know that.
when you start getting
Wow.
into it, yeah, it's really dark, some of the stuff. And survivor's guilt, where his wife got sick and died, in the second one, and things like that. And it deals with a lot of those themes in the Silent Hill series and other video games that are horror based games.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Well, Sucker Punch was made into it was Sucker Punch a video game
Sucker Punch, I think, is a studio.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because the film with the girls,
it was
they're
done.
escaping
Yeah.
reality,
Yeah,
and
Yeah.
it's not horror.
it was done in
Yeah.
a very video game kind of style.
Yeah.
Yes,
The way
it
they
was.
did it.
That's why that made me think of that. And they're like afraid for their mother gets killed by their stepdad, and they're like they run away because they're afraid of him.
Yeah,
Uh, but yeah, like the Haunting of Alejandra, um, you get it's about La Llorona, the woman who killed her two children and herself. Uh, and I wanted to go into that, the what would drive someone to do that? Why did someone make up this story if it's even made up? Um, and it doesn't even have to be a mother, it could be any parent. What would drive any person to do that? Um, and so again, like the manifestation of what's going on. Um, Definitely, it's, we all kind of have these inner lives, but they can be reflected in the outer world. And I think that's quite fascinating. Um, and you see that in Tigers Are Not Afraid with, when you start seeing the apparitions and the things coming out, and it's just like, oh my God, it's there. While you're trying to hold back the tears, like, oh, where are these kids? Uh,
I
it
think
it really seemed to me, and this has happened on quite a few films for us. It seemed more like a drama almost with horror
mm,
elements than
yeah,
a horror.
it
I
was
mean
it was
a g-
softer horror. It wasn't as like in your face
Yeah,
horror um like a slasher or a creature film. So like I watched Smile not too long ago.
yeah,
And then, at first you're like, oh, what is this thing? And then you finally see it, the demon, and you're like, oh my God. But that's kind of like in the same in the same kind of genre we're talking about with the manifestation of your mental health and trauma, how it's, you traumatize someone, or you expose them to trauma, and it does leave a lasting effect, and that will then, affect others. I
yeah,
don't know if
I
you guys
think
think now.
so. I think with Tigers Are Not Afraid, I think you're one of the things that I've slowly been trying to challenge myself the last few years is to not necessarily reevaluate the way that I look at the genre of horror, but what the genre of horror can be. So, a few years ago, I wasn't reading horror books. Obviously, as of this podcast, you can obviously see that's changed vastly. And then you brought up, yeah, I always butcher how to
La,
say it.
La Llorona, yeah.
Yes. So Shudder did a movie that was called that.
La Llorona.
Yeah, and
The weeping lady.
the weeping woman. And I mean, I put it off for so long because like I was really burnt out on how Hollywood took that in the Conjuring universe. And when you watch that movie, the Shudder movie that they did a couple years ago, it's completely different, and you're getting to kind of see a movie that is kind of using that legend of La Llorona. Am I saying?
Yeah, La Llorona, the weeping
La,
lady.
yeah, you're getting to see that, but kind of like in this like as a metaphor for like how a the subject of war has torn this country apart.
Yeah, genocide and rape, and these generals, and it's not even like, it's the doing it to their own people, the greed of it. And yeah, about the horror and the terror of genocide. Um, Again, horror is great. You can create these stories and these narratives that, in a way that we people will watch it and will can possibly relate. So I remember when I was a kid, I watched this film about the Khmer Rouge called The Killing Fields. It's a really old film.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, same.
And I've never and it's not a horror, it's like a drama,
Yeah.
but it is horror. It is, I mean, horrific. I remember watching and thinking, "Oh my God." Um
And
and what's worse is it really happened. It's real. It's real. Just like the Shutter La Llorona, that really happened in Guatemala. Those dictators exist. That kind of genocide existed. But then the other side of horror, which is like um, Many Faces of Death, for example,
sure.
which I mean, I've seen, I saw that way too young, but that's just like really in your face horror of a different kind.
And I
Oh,
think
I mean,
tigers.
yeah. Talking about that kind of thing, you get into movies like was it Hotel Rwanda, and
Yeah,
Mm,
the horrors of the genocide that was going on down there. It really does, or even more American one, Black Hawk Down. The
yeah.
events that happen with that, it goes from being. I know people that have watched those kind of movies and can't finish them because it's just too almost hits too close to home. Because I'm in a military town. We're in Norfolk, Virginia. It's one of the biggest
Oh, yeah.
military towns in the world, and we I've heard some stories from some of the vets and soldiers and stuff. Um, but yeah, and one of the things I find interesting is that this um, was this one was Mexican, wasn't it? Or took
Yeah.
place in Mexico? Okay. Didn't want to make a generalized statement. I was just trying. I thought it was, but one thing I find interesting with horror is when you find the foreign stuff. So this in particular, and a lot of Asian, they have a way
mm,
of building suspense and atmosphere that you can take the same story, like even if you look at The Ring or The Grudge and you look at their Japanese counterparts, Ringu or Ju-on,
Yeah.
it doesn't have the same feeling or atmosphere. And this is one of those stories that you hear similar events happening here in the States. I don't think it could have been replicated in a manner to make it a local film to have the
Mm.
same impact that this would have.
yeah.
Well, it's like,
And
yeah. Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
Like
Uh,
Old Boy. They tried to do Old Boy with Josh
Mhm.
Brolin and like all shiny, and you're like, no, the original Korean Old
yeah.
Boy is
Yeah.
like terrifying. Like you're you can't. That was, I think that's like exactly what you're talking about, Mark. Like Old Boy, I think is a great example of that, where you're like,
I think a lot of that
touching.
also comes from the countries that these movies come from have a better understanding of their own superstition and beliefs,
Yeah,
and we're trying to corporatize them into
yeah.
just a quick box office hit kind of thing. A lot of times is what happens. They lose that connection to the story and the beliefs and the superstitions.
No, La Llorona, the
Mm.
that is a perfect example of the two if you put them together.
Yeah.
Um, I loved the first Conjuring actually. I that
Same.
scared me. I really scared. And then I had high hopes for the Nun, and I was just like,
Oh yeah. Eh, that hurt me.
uh,
But
I was like,
Annabelle Creation,
no.
Annabelle Creation was really good. The second Annabelle movie. The third one was fun, but the second one was really good.
Coming the create
Creation was Annabelle. Annabelle Creation. Annabelle Comes Home
Yeah.
so
Annabelle
is
Creation is the
was
one
the
about the Annabelle
prequel.
doll being made.
Yeah.
and the little girl
Like
who ends up leaving. Yeah, okay, I
yeah,
know.
that
She's
one was really good.
possessed and takes the doll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
There's so many. I have to like keep them straight in my mind.
yeah. But coming back to Tigers Are Not Afraid, I think one of the things that Mark, I would argue that, makes this a horror film is not only the way that it is actually showcasing the very real terrors of not only this town but the kids and the cartels. And I think that this is a movie that makes the viewer uncomfortable to the point where you have to realize that there are stories like this that happen all over, and there are mental health stories that are constantly being affected by this stuff. And what I think is really ingenious about this film is the way that it uses elements of fantasy as kind of a linchpin for escapism, which is the
Yeah,
real reason that at least us here in the States, the real reason most of us come to a film is to escape our own life, all of the problems and everything that's going on, whether it's in our marriages, parenthoods, schools, jobs, whatever. We go to a film to escape for 2.5 3 hours. So that's why I feel like there's such a predominant force here with fantasy, whether you're talking about Marvel movies or Avatar or tentpole films that just kind of seem to dominate the box office the last few years. Whereas this film feels like an inverted version of that, where it throws you into the mental health capacity of this really broken village, and you're kind of experiencing the vulnerability of these characters, but yet at the same time they're using their own form of escapism to escape the realities of uh, facing
of
death. Yeah,
violence and death when kids should be playing and feel safe and secure, but they're having to be like little adults. And as a child, how do you kids that age are make believing and have um imaginary friends, and they're playing games, and they live in this different world than us adults, but then they're having to live in an adult world and handle it like an adult. So for me, yeah, that I think that's right on the fantasy, because that's kind of how kids are. They do live in a fantasy in some respects with it when it comes to their world. I have a 9-year old, and he is obsessed with comics. He loves comics, and he's creating his own comics. And they're just these fantastic little things that he creates, and these characters and these names. And it's just, wow, his imagination. Imagine that imagination with the terrors that these kids in the film are experiencing. And kids love animals,
yeah.
tigers. My daughter has a ton of animals in her room, soft toys, because animals are strong. Animals are beautiful, and they're big and powerful. So, yeah, all of that, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I loved about this movie too is that you're specifically fantasy is that this film opens up on probably the most heartbreaking way, where you have kids that are talking about fairy tales and like three elements that you would use to write your own. And our main protagonist, Estrella, basically is given three pieces of chalk that are to represent like you get three wishes. And so you kind of get to see how she uses the three wishes throughout the course of the film. And this this film like thrives on that. And I think that like I don't know about either of you, but I know that I've had some pretty traumatic things in my life happen, and one of them, I've talked about on here before, is I lost a friend to suicide, and not knowing how to cope with that, to I turned to horror movies, and I turned to the genre that like allowed me to escape for an hour and a half, 2 hours, so that I didn't have these overwhelming questions of survivor's guilt and playing out all these different scenarios in my head. And there are definitely times where like I have like movies that like I reserve for like if I'm having a bad day, those are comfort films that are going in, whether that is Mean Girls or Step Brothers,
You
or
and your Mean Girls.
look,
Me.
man,
High
Mean
school
Girls
was a
is
horror for
life.
some people.
um, but I have those movies that like I always have on lock. Like I love a Goofy movie, and uh man, I just Hot Rod's another one that is like a great movie to throw on anytime you need a laugh, because I just Andy Samberg is the
A,
goat.
a lot of mine is 80s movies.
Yeah, I was
80s
That's
movies
because
same.
is mine.
that's because I'm younger than both of you guys. So
But
I
even
love the 80s movies,
oh
man.
yeah.
Those are comfort watches.
Yeah,
I
the
won't deny that.
Ghostbusters are just
Yes.
classic. Real Genius, one of Val Kilmer's early films, is
Hmm.
awesome. It's amazing. My Science Project.
Oh my
I mean,
gosh.
you got Stripes from the late 80s, Caddyshack.
I've always liked, I mean, so I wrote a vampire book and I had to put a knot in it. And I always liked Revenge of the Nerds.
Yep. Revenge of the Nerds was great. Eh,
And you've got the voice down, Mark. So you got the voice.
yeah. I haven't seen Revenge of the Nerds in a long time.
You've got the voice of I remember.
Oh, was that not Booger, but
No, Booger is a nerd. The voice I'm talking about,
Ogre.
he's one of the cool guys.
Ogre.
Ogre, yes.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
got the
Ogre was
ogre
awesome.
voice. Yeah, I love Revenge of the Nerds just because it's like, the little guys coming on top and it's really entertaining and yeah.
Something, and nobody has mentioned it in this one. Something I noticed that stands out in a lot of horror when you watch it. They imply when pets get killed for the most part, and you might see the aftermath. Same thing with kids. This movie was very direct and graphic with kids being killed.
Yes.
And it also plays into the girl's character and her wishes. Are the
Yeah,
wishes actually just a way for her to cope with what's going on? Because she goes in to kill what's his name? Was it Kako?
El Chulo.
No, at the beginning when she goes in to kill him. That
Yeah.
wasn't that wasn't him.
I
Uh she goes in and she's standing behind him with the gun to kill him. And I wish this could already be done. And he kind of rolls to one side with a bullet hole in his head. She's at another point, she wishes for her mom, and the ghost starts showing up, and they kind of start guiding her at a
yeah.
certain point. Uh, and, yeah. Yes,
I, I
Josh.
I was gonna say, like, to before you get off on the tangent, I think that you mentioned the whole aspect of this film embracing uh the deaths of the children and being very blunt about that. And I think that for a film like this that is showcasing poverty, the with everything with the cartels and violence, this film, I think that this film, you need that. I think this is one of those rare films that, for in order to get for Lopez to get her point across to the audience
Mhm.
and to really immerse you into that world, you have to embrace the deaths of those kids, because it's uncomfortable, but at the same time, it wakes you up to reality. It says that, man, like, maybe my life isn't so terrible, that like this is the reality for some people.
Well, I mean, the worst in this film, the worst being probably Shine's death.
Yeah, Shine's death ruined me, man.
And
It's
that
like, no.
also that goes back to her wishes. Because
Yeah.
just as it happened, she goes, I wish your scar was gone. It was gone, just not the way she expected.
No, I that's why I struggled with this. I had to like take breaks.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think I could have watched it in a movie theater. I had to take breaks because I have children and watching
Yeah.
anything with children I struggle with, but I also know that there are places in the world where children are dying all the time. That's the reality. And in Mexico, and not just Mexico, but at the border, a lot of children have died in detention, alone on a cement floor, trying to cross, they're by themselves and they die from things like the flu. They die from basic things. And um, no one wants to talk about that or face it, but it's true. It's like the film, it was a drama. It's called Lion. Have you guys heard of it?
I have. I know exactly the movie you're talking about. I haven't seen it, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Oh my God. Literally, I had the same reaction to Lion as Tigers Are Not Afraid from the first child's death. And, this little body laid out. I mean, I lost it. But another film that's from South America, maybe you guys have seen, is called Terrified.
I
It's on my
also know
list.
it is same.
Have you seen that one?
We haven't
No.
seen it, but it's on our list. I keep coming
So
across it and hearing that
I'm
it's
not
really
going to
good.
tell you, but it's not as heart-wrenching as Tigers Are Not Afraid, because you're not building the whole movie around this group of kids. But there's a kid in there, a scene with a kid, and you're just like, wait, what? What? It's shocking. You're like, what? Huh? And I didn't have the same emotional effect because um, the child is already dead, but it doesn't make it less shocking. Whereas in Tigers Not Afraid, you really have that emotional tie to them and you're really invested. But Terrified, yeah, that's a trip, man. That is a wild one. You're like, oh my, from the beginning, you're like, oh
Yeah.
my God.
Yeah,
I've
that's on
heard
Shutter,
that.
isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
Shutter exclusive. I've heard a lot of people say that like it's a mind F and like coming out of it like I think this one would it's been on my list for a while, so I will eventually get around to watching it. But like also I think
It's lighter.
yeah. I think on the subject of like, this one also dealing with kids and the violence aspect of it early on. I don't remember the character's name, but it's the kid that had the actual like pet tiger when he
Mateo.
gets Mateo. Is it Mateo?
Mhm.
Okay. So he is the one that ends up getting kidnapped and taken by the cartel, and you have this heartbreaking like sink in your feeling where it's like, all right, he's at this point it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat because you're not sure if the kid is alive or if he's dead. You're not sure really what fate is worse. And then later on, when the film does actually show, it's this, it's the it's the first wish scene where she comes in, Estella, and essentially like rescues all of these kids out of cages that are just kind of kept in this back room. And I think this film also touches on a really important topic that we in the States probably don't talk about enough. And I'm saying this on the verge of also the Super Bowl. When we're recording this, is the fact of human trafficking. And this film definitely has a subplot of human trafficking, and human trafficking is an issue that probably doesn't get the conversations that it necessarily deserves to be had.
No, absolutely. And like, um, yeah, but Jennifer Lopez had the cages with the kids in her halftime show because of, the things that have happened to children um along the border. And yeah, it's definitely when you have that kind of chaos, uh those kind of things are going to happen. Again, horror allows you to uh explore those things. And I've seen some really brutal horror about war. There's one I watched that was set in Eastern Europe, and I was just like, I don't know if I no, I did finish it, but I just was watching it like this the whole time, like, oh my God, it was the most brutal thing I've ever seen.
Jeez.
Um,
Yeah, there's been a few, and I've got two of them I could see in my head right now. I just can't think of the names.
yeah, I can't
That
think of the name either. It was so long ago, but I was like, oh my God.
Yeah,
Um,
one of them was like some English troops. I think it was World War I, or find a trench in the fog, and they're stuck in the fogged out trench, and essentially the horrors of war are entering the trench with them. I
yeah,
think it was called something like the
no,
Outpost.
this one was like modern day
Ah,
where
okay.
these girls are being trafficked and kept. I mean, it
Gotcha,
was off,
gotcha.
it was really brutal. Um, but again, you could take this and definitely make it a drama. And, it's something like Parasite, for example, which was a drama. But my God, the whole
That last
concept.
act.
I hear a lot of good things about that one, but haven't seen it.
But
That
honestly, the whole kind of concept of it is like what you'd expect from a horror film with the secret room, I don't want to give too much away if no one's if you haven't seen it, but like the secrets, I'm just gonna say that, like the way the house is and the things that happen, you'd expect that. You've seen that in a few horror films. But again, this family, they're really poor and working for the very rich family, and the
yeah.
things that happen again, uh they packaged it as a drama and it did really well, and I'm so glad Parasite did well, but it did push the boundaries of, well,
Ah,
this kind of stuff happens. That's a great one.
yeah. I remember seeing that in theaters and like hearing all this hype and this like goodwill about it. And I was like, all right, like I mean, this is okay. Like, and then it got to that last act where the twist happens, and I was like gripping my seat for dear life the entire time. I was like, nobody prepared me for this. No one, not one.
Mm-hmm. Because it's that slow kind of.
Oh yeah, it's a lot more effective that way. My wife didn't want to know anything about it. She had heard all the hype too, and we watched it at we rented it and watched it a few months after I'd seen it, and it won the best Oscar that year. And she was watching it, and she was just like, okay, okay. The twist happened, and she's like, we need to watch like The Office or something lighter now. I just need to laugh.
And this is Parasite.
This is Parasite.
Okay. All right.
Mhm.
I know one we saw a couple of years back at one of the actually the last 3 day Psychorama 3 day weekend. They had one called The Dark. It was a kid gets kidnapped, and the kidnapper and the kid end up going out into the woods where people have mysteriously died, to find out it's a little girl that's a zombie. And you find out what it is that she has basically become a monster because of her stepdad.
Mm.
And the
Cool.
movie is her essentially learning to become human again through the progression of the story and how things are going down.
Oh, wow.
I think it's on Amazon. It's called The Dark from 2018.
Yeah, it's now streaming on Tubi if anyone is interested in checking it out. And
Oh,
it's only an hour and a half. Um,
sounds familiar.
And it's
but
the funny thing was we took an interest before we found out what the full movie was about. The little girl has the same name as my daughter. So
nice.
yeah, she's actually
Um,
she's actually quarter Puerto Rican.
nice.
So I heard some fun stories from her.
I need to see
Trans
that.
translated from her great grandmother.
Oh, is this the boy blind? Is the boy blind? Does she meet a boy?
He was either blind or was blinded, one or the other.
Okay, I started watching this. I didn't finish it.
Yeah,
I think, yeah.
yeah.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I heard some stories from my um, ex-wife's grandma, who was like straight from Puerto Rico. She didn't
Mm,
she didn't speak English, so there was
wow.
some translation along the way. But we heard some interesting stories from that she when she was growing up as a kid down there.
Oh, I can imagine. Can imagine, yeah. I'm reading a book called Infested by um Angel Luis Colon. and he's Puerto Rican, and it's a YA, a young adult book. And it's really good. I'm halfway through it. It's called Infested. It's really fun.
Yeah.
But it's like all about like being Puerto Rican, and he moved to the Bronx, and it's really good. So yes, and he's a
Appa-
great writer.
Apparently, that's one of the big moving points when they leave Puerto Rico. A lot of them go up to New York and the Bronx and that area, and that's
Mm,
exactly what she did. She
yeah,
went up there and all that stuff. I think they said they were Toano,
yeah,
actual Toano
yeah.
descent.
That's the indigenous.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Hmm.
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
my
You have to
daughter's a
look.
quarter.
Oh,
She's 25%. So
you have to look up this writer. He's really good, and
Uh, I haven't pulled up right now on my computer. I did not realize that MTV made books. Did
they
not
just
realize that was
started
the
again.
thing.
well, I
Yeah,
mean,
and
they haven't played music in like 30 years, so they got to do something but not put out music videos.
yeah, he wrote a book, a novella called Hell Chose Me, and that's really good. And it's a short story, a short book. It's real. He writes a lot of crime, so he's known in the crime world, but the crime he's known he's a crime lord. No, he writes crime, but Hell Chose Me has a lot of supernatural elements with the crime. It's really good. But he's definitely a writer to read.
All right. It's you have piqued my interest.
Mm.
It's on my list.
Hell Chose Me.
Ooh.
Start with that one.
Yeah, I have it here. It's like a pink book. All
Yeah.
right. Well, as we're winding down on this podcast, Mark, there's one thing that you brought up at the beginning of this a few minutes ago that I want to end on in terms of Tigers Are Not Afraid.
I couldn't
Um,
remember the title.
on whether or not Estella is actually using the wishes and kind of the more fantastical elements um as like a means of coping. And I think that this emphasizes the very great format of like escapism. And it does beg that question, like, is she actually seeing what the audience is seeing, or is she seeing something completely different?
Yeah, are the wishes a way for her to cope with what's going on as opposed to actually dealing with what's there?
And I don't know if you guys felt this way, but like this movie to me, like with the elements of fantasy and kind of the dramatic and kind of how they wove together, this movie reminded me of like a more modern version of Pan's Labyrinth, to where Pan's Labyrinth takes place in like the early 1900s, whereas this
Yes,
one,
and the little girl, and she
yeah,
meets. That was terrifying. They're like
it was.
Pans, oh man,
horrible.
that's one of those movies that I saw twice in the theater, and both times there were people coming in with like kids, thinking it was a kids movie, not
No.
realizing that it was like an adult fairy tale of violence.
Yeah.
And the
This
fawn is awesome.
Yeah, Pan's Labyrinth is a movie that I expected to be a lot more fantastical, and I'm probably going to get some crap for this, but I think Tigers Are Not Afraid is a better movie because not only does the narrative feel more concise, but also at the same time, I think it uses its fantastical elements way better than Pan's Labyrinth. That's a hot take, but that's how I
Well,
feel.
they're two
Yeah,
different movies.
They
yeah,
They're
they're
are.
very. But
they're
I
ve-
understand what you mean about
yeah.
the fantasy and where reality and fantasy takes over. Oh man, there's a term in literature called magical realism,
Mm.
where magic is part of your existence, and there are a lot of um, Latinx, teen stories that are considered magical realism, and a lot of us have written in that genre. Um, I tend to go harder than so if you read Mestiza Blood, you really get the to the throat. And it's very real. For this, uh, honestly, I want the fantasy to be real. I want to believe, because, you know, I grew up with the idea, and I guess why I loved the horror as well and ghost stories is because it was like very real to me. These forces exist. These things are around us. It could be very real. But if you were to watch this as like, no, it's grounded in reality, then it's just someone, these poor children trying to cope. But again, it's a toss up. I don't know. It's like, it's heartbreaking to think about that it's not real. You know, it's just so heartbreaking, especially as a mom, because I have three children, and I just think, oh my God. But I do have those kind of alternative beliefs. So I have all my Santa Muerte candles that I light. I have a little altar, um, and all of the offerings. So she's got all of her jewelry. um, yeah, her little bottle of tequila and the ofrenda. So I do believe in that kind of thing. And I've got my feather. Um, but so I want to say that I believe it happened. That she does get wishes.
I think Pan's Labyrinth did a better job of being the fairy tale,
Mm,
where this one did a better job of the real life
yeah,
and,
yeah. It
and
felt
coping
hard.
with it. Yeah.
It's so hard. I mean,
Where Pan's Labyrinth was, is this an actual fairy tale? Because you don't know she's really dying at the end and everything was just in her head as she's dying.
Yeah.
mm,
Or was it really a fairy tale and she's actually moving on, as the story suggests? Where in this, it's she's coping using the wishes. I wish I had my mom back. I wish this happened. I wish somebody else could kill him, not me. It's it was almost like it was her way of coping and imagining what could happen and how she wanted it to happen, as opposed to what was really going on.
yeah,
I read an article earlier this weekend, and the article was kind of talking about this social media personality that essentially had like two different versions that she presented of herself. One version was this digital, like, OnlyFans kind of personality where, you know, she's like embracing like sexuality and stuff like that. And she has this like very conservative, like, portion of her personality in like real life. And I think that, you know, when you talk about the things of like fantasy and like escapism, it's so easy nowadays to do something like that because not only do you have literally every uh song, every film, every video game literally at your touch and at your beckon. I mean, I can't, Mark, I'm not a video game guy, so I don't know how long it takes for a video game to download, but you know, you have it now readily available at on demand. And with social media, you can also create any kind of persona that you want and project it out there and live almost two lives running parallel with one another. And so I think this movie is very relevant to today's standards, especially with how divided we all kind of feel. You know, I don't want to watch the news. You know, it's very depressing.
And I think one thing people forget is that we have a lot more in common as a whole than things like you said, the news. You don't want to watch the news wants to let us believe.
Yeah.
They can't get the viewership if we're all kumbaya and getting along, you know?
Yeah,
yeah.
and And also in that way, like I mean, not to like, I don't want to open up a big can of worms, but like there are also like news outlets that are like essentially like creating their own narratives. So like they
Mm,
might be all presenting on the same stories, but depending, I hate that it's this way, but depending on where you fall politically, that's how you spin that narrative,
mm.
regardless of however you do it. And we live in this day and age now where like you can literally edit anything to fit into that narrative.
Hmm. Yeah, it's it is the, people living in fantasy worlds, and you just think, okay, what is real? What are you what are you trying to achieve by creating these narratives in your mind and then passing them on to other people? And what is that? What are the consequences of that? You know?
And yeah, and I think that like media like Tigers Are Not Afraid, Ya Llorona, and some of the other films that we've talked about, even some of the books that we've mentioned on this podcast, like I think those are challenges to us as modern viewers, is because it's asking us to step outside of our comfort zone. I mean, I think this is almost 50 episodes. I think this is maybe the first or second Spanish movie that we've covered.
Yeah,
Um, and I would definitely say that this is probably one of the heavier films that we've covered in this
yeah,
podcast. Um, but at the same time, like this movie, I felt I walked away from this movie feeling really challenged to like
yeah,
know more about like problems abroad and stuff like that, and kind of like finding out like, all right, like clearly the mental health of cultures are different across the board. And that's really what I like about reading your stories, V, is because it feels like I'm getting to step not only inside these characters, but I'm getting to step inside of a completely different culture that is like just different than mine. Like I felt really immersed into the culture of Queens of Cicadas, and understanding the brokenheartedness of the characters and the lore, and just getting to kind of step outside for of myself for like a week and a half when I read it, is like, all right, there's more mental health brokenness than what we see in our own narratives.
yeah. And when you read The Haunting of Alejandra, you'll definitely see that, and it carries on. Again, what causes a parent to abandon their 5 children? What causes a parent to kill their children and themselves? What would drive someone to want another murdered? And you'll get that through The Haunting of Alejandra. And just on one last thing for Tiger's Not Afraid, I like that it shows a different aspect of the cartels, because you often get like El Chapo, and you get focused on the cartel and not the people that are, the
Yeah.
essentially the collateral damage, um, of all of this, of and so I'm glad that she focused on a different side and not the cartel or the
Yeah.
cartel boss.
And a lot of them, if you watch, like you mentioned El Chapo, a lot of them are almost presented in a lot of news and media as almost the heroes, almost glamorized to be who
And
they are.
sometimes they're treated like that because they bring
Mm.
money in, and they're like, oh, let me be generous, let me buy your love, let me buy your affection, let me do this. um
Yeah, Netflix had a series, I think it's called Dark Tourism, where they went to where oh, that big 80s drug lord that I can't remember his name now. They went to the town that he ran, Pablo Escobar,
okay, yeah,
and they talked about him like he was a hero for the people
yeah,
and everything
because
because he
they did
kept
what
them. Yeah,
He's
yeah. And
yeah, I read.
it's one episode that, and one of the guys that's giving the tour is like one of his ex hitmen, and that's the guy giving the tour to the host of the show.
It's
And
crazy.
they all talk about him like he was a hero and everything,
Hmm.
even though when you look at what he did, he was
Ruthless.
a monster.
Yeah, I'm reading a book. I've had to put it down for another novel I'm writing, and it's called Dope, and it's about the drug trade. And marijuana is not even indigenous to Mexico. You know, all of these drugs were actually brought into the country, and it talks about the history all the way back from the conquest of the drug trade until now. It's really fascinating, and it talks about the first cartels and that when the first drug bosses, and there were no schools, there were no roads, there were none of these infrastructures the government should have been doing, and they did it. I mean, obviously, for their own reasons, but yeah, it's a good book.
I feel like if people walked away from this episode with anything else, not only do you have to go check out Tigers Are Not Afraid on Shudder, you have a bunch of other movies to check out, and you have so many books to check out, including Miss Castro's own library, ever-growing library, I guess is a more better word to say that. Where can people follow you online, though?
Yeah, so I am V Latina London on Twitter and Instagram, V Castro Books on TikTok. I feel really old there. um, I have my website, V Castro Stories, and I've just started another website called La Muerte Market, which is all the Latinx merch, horror merch. I just got a new piece of art that's coming in about La Lechuza, which is so badass. I love it. It's got like the, LA vibe with the claw and the skull. So all of that's coming out soon. But yeah, so follow. Thank you so much for all of you that have picked up the books, that have reviewed, shared. I mean, it really makes a difference. And yeah, I it's nice to connect with you guys. So hopefully I'll hear more from you guys if you're listening.
Yeah, I would love to bring you back.
Yeah.
I like I said, I absolutely loved Goddess of Filth. This is an amazing book. Um, Also, I am gotta recommend Queen of Cicadas, another really complex book, but really heartbreaking, really beautifully read. And then this one I'm excited about reading next. This is on my next list once I finish my current book.
And send me
Uh,
your address, a good address to send you the
oh, I
copy
got you.
of Alejandra. So I'll sign
Got you.
it.
Got you. All right, Mark, where can people find you online?
I've actually done some updating on Instagram. So it's been an ongoing joke because I'll go long periods of time without posting anything. And I paint miniatures and war game models and stuff. And I've actually started updating with one project I'm working on for a tournament prize support and my adventures getting into 3D printing. So yeah, titanium juggernaut painting on Instagram.
Ooh.
Yeah, so make sure that you guys go follow all of his projects. I'm really glad that you were able to update it, you know. Uh you guys can
Social media
follow.
is hard.
Look, I always plug my socials. The only social that I'm active on is Letterbox, so it's at Captain Nostalgia over there. Much like V, I'm also on TikTok and feel incredibly old and awkward and weird. But you guys can get down with some good Hellraiser content. It's Gent Ghostface, Gent.
Nice.
Yeah, so but you guys can follow our parent company, Victims and Villains. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, and of course, wherever you guys get your podcast from. Make sure that you guys also subscribe to Abyss Gazing. And remember that the longer you gaze into the abyss, the more the abyss gazes back into you.
Woo.